We're up to chapter 23, Tea Lights on Potatoes. Hello and welcome back to Riverwood Cabin. I'm Rosie Boom and I'm reading to you from Where Lions Roar at Night. We're up to chapter 23, Tea Lights on Potatoes. The storm hit at 3 the next morning and woke Milly up. She lay in bed and listened to the pounding rain as it beat upon the tin roof. It sounded so fierce that she thought it might cut holes through the tin. She could see Mum and Dad's light shining up through the cracks in the loft floor. At least they were awake. She pulled the covers up around her ears and tried to block out some of the noise of the loud drumming rain. When she woke 2 hours later, it was still pouring. She got out of bed and peered out the window. She could just make out a dark shape near Smoking Bridge. It was Dad, dressed in all his wet weather farm gear, and he was digging. She tiptoed downstairs and climbed into bed with Mum. "What's Daddy doing?" "He's clearing the drain and digging ditches," replied Mum. "He's been out there since it was light enough to see." A strong wind began to howl around the barn, and the windows and walls began to shake and rattle. Mum grabbed her laptop, jumped back into bed and checked the weather forecast. "Oh boy," she said, "they're predicting gale force winds of up to 180 kilometres an hour and heaps more heavy rain." She looked at Milly. "Well, Dad's got his wish. At least he's here for this storm." Breakfast was a scrambled affair. Dad came in drenched and cold and sat by the fire, trying to warm his hands. But the next minute a huge gust hit the east wall of the barn and it waved crazily in and out. Milly's mouth went dry. It looked like the whole thing was about to collapse. Dad leaped to his feet and shouted for Josiah, "Get the ladder, Joe!" He ran out to his shed and came back with some long pieces of timber. "We need to brace the wall or we're going to lose it," he shouted to Josiah above the roar of the wind. Mum steadied the ladder for Dad, who had climbed up and begun bracing the wall. "It sounds like an angry bull charging us." Rain began driving in through the corner of the barn. "It's just like last time." "Great," muttered Josiah as he nailed the other end of the brace to one of the rafters. At last Dad climbed down and looked at the wall. It rattled and shook, but no longer looked as if it was going to collapse. "Well done, darling," said Mum. "That was a bit scary." Dad smiled at her, but Milly thought he still looked a bit worried. Just then, a small edge of one of the sheets of roofing tin began to lift and flap in the gale. Dad's eyes snapped to the ceiling. "Good grief, we could lose the roof." He ran outside, dragging the ladder with him. Mum put on a raincoat and went out with him to steady the ladder. "Be careful," Milly heard her say. There was no relief from the noise. The rain thundered down on the roof and against the windows. The barn creaked and groaned and rattled as the storm shook it. It made Milly think of the poor possum that Angel had shaken so fiercely. Outside, the river seemed to rise before their eyes. One minute they had an island, the next it had disappeared completely. Brown water surged across the back paddock and tumbled into the water already racing around the island. "Milly," called Dad from the roof, "you need to move Peony to higher ground." Milly ran outside to put on a raincoat and her gumboots. In all the excitement, she'd forgotten about Peony. She could just make out her shape through the rain. She was standing with her back to the wind and rain, her head hanging low. Milly called to her, but the wind snatched her voice away. It grabbed her raincoat hood and whipped it against her face. The rain stung her cheeks and nose. She leaned into the wind and waded through the dirty water. Peony looked up and nickered to her. Milly gave her a piece of carrot and then put the halter on. Peony's breath blew warm against her hand. "Come on, girl, let's get you somewhere safer." Peony curled her body around, not wanting to face the wind. Milly pulled on the rope, and finally Peony lowered her head and followed her across the flooded field. Milly felt like any minute the wind would pick her up and toss her into the top of one of the totara trees. She blinked hard and tried to find the gate through the sheet of rain. As soon as they reached the paddock, Peony spun around and turned her back to the wind again. She looked miserable. Milly wished she could bring her inside the barn and dry her off in front of the fire. "I'm sorry, girl," she whispered, and then ran back towards the barn. A strange noise stopped her in her tracks. She stood still and listened. It was the bulls. Their bellows mingled with the wind and rain, and the eerie sound made Milly shiver. She ran over to their paddock. They had churned around in it until it was a sea of mud. Dad was there, struggling to set up an electric fence. "Are you okay?" she shouted. He looked up and motioned with his hand for her to get inside. When she got back to the barn, Mum and the girls were once again moving furniture and lifting the carpet. Sam and Jake had loaded all the books from the bookshelves into boxes, and Josiah was stacking the boxes in the middle of the room. Dad's dripping face appeared at the door. "Joe, quick! We need to secure the shed out the back before it blows away." Joe groaned and went outside to put on his raincoat. Milly ran to the window to watch, but all she could see was a sheet of grey rain and the dark silhouettes of trees whipping wildly against the sky. "Stoke the fire, Milly," said Mum. "Dad and Joe will be freezing when they come back in." But Dad and Joe didn't come and didn't come. The sky outside grew darker and darker. Somewhere behind the wall of grey, the hidden sun retreated to fairer lands, and the storm raged on in blackness. Milly stopped watching for Dad out the window and helped Ellie set the table while Mum got the spicy meatloaf out of the homewood. Suddenly, the blackness outside rushed into the barn. Milly squealed with fright. All she could see was the red glow of the fire. "It's all right," said Mum. "The power's just gone off. Grab your torch, Sam, and find me some candles." Sam ran off to get his torch. He knew just where it was. Soon the barn glowed with candlelight. Mum found several of her precious kerosene lanterns and lit them too. "Just as well you love candles, eh, Mum?" grinned Jake. Mum laughed. "Yes, we won't have any shortage of candles, that's for sure." Milly smiled. Every birthday and Mother's Day, at least one of the children gave Mum a candle. Mum went to the door and opened it a fraction. The wind caught it and tried to rip it out of her hands. She quickly shut it and leaned against it for a moment. Well, there's no use calling Dad and Joe in for dinner. There's no way they'd hear us in this racket. They sat around the table by the warmth of the fire and blessed the food and prayed for Dad and Joe, battling the storm outside. At last, the door opened and Dad and Josiah ducked in. Everyone clapped and cheered. They looked like drowned rats. Mum jumped up and fetched some towels while Dad and Joe huddled by the fire, rubbing their hands and stretching them out to the warmth. Kate got their dinners out of the oven and set them close to the fire. "It is so wild out there," Dad told them. "I haven't seen anything like it before. I could barely stand up in the wind." "I was getting a bit worried about you," said Mum. "I was glad I had Joe with me. It would have been hard work on my own." He took his plate and then carefully balanced a small tea light candle on his potato. Mum watched him in amazement and then laughed and clapped her hands. "Now that takes the cake." Dad looked up at her and grinned. "You know I like to see what I'm eating." Millie giggled at the sight of the candle perched on his potato. "Is Mum's cooking that bad?" "Maybe it is," laughed Mum. What a day. I don't think I'll ever forget this storm in a hurry. Or you, Chris, with that ridiculous candle.